Welcome back to JP's Budget Collecting and our weekly look back at the hot comics from 6 months ago. This week we're looking back at the hot comics from February 11th, 2023. I'm recording this on August 10th, 2023. As always, I give you those dates so you know when this information is actually relevant because the market is always moving and changing. As you'll see by the price differences of just 6 months that we talk about here late coming up. As always, we're also looking back at the CBSI Hot Top 10 and the Comic Tom Key Collector Hottest Trending Comics of the Week. Each week they put out a list of 10 books, and we look at those to see what was going on in the market back then, what factors were making books hot, and what those books have done since those factors went away or just weren't mentioned very much. In general, if you've been watching this show, you know that patience tends to pay off, but let's see what happened this week and see if we can learn anything about these 17 books. Once again, we're in a week where Tom's list was super late, so I did the CBSI list, and then I did kind of predictions for my show. So not every one of Tom's books will have a prediction from me in the bottom. So I don't think so. Anyway, so I think I got like I went 6 and 7, I guess. So maybe just one didn't have a prediction for me. So anyway, 17 books to talk about. Let's dig in and see what we can learn. First up, we have Witches, #1. From 2014, and like last week we had a couple books that hit the list because Amazon had made a whole bunch of announcements about potential shows coming up. Witches was another one of those shows announced for an animated Amazon series. Back then it was going for $20 to $30, 9.8, 100 to 125, so nothing too crazy, but it was it definitely jumped up. Now it's a $10 to $20 book. 9.8, 60 to 80. So this one's definitely turned into a trap. It is definitely backed up significantly from what it was 6 months ago. But so we'll see. I know they've talked about Witches has been on off list multiple times. It's been talked about for a long time. Now it's going to animated. We'll see if it's enough to move the needle later on, if it ever even gets made. You never know with these things. Next, we have Butterfly, #1, also from 2014, also announced for an Amazon show. This one I didn't write down if it was animated or live action, but yeah, so this book, I think less well known than Witches before this, but it jumped crazy, probably because it's a little bit harder to find, but it was going for 50 to 90 back then. 9.8 hit all the way up to 200. And now it's a $15 to $40 book. No 9.8 sales. Yeah, this is a dumpster fire. This one plummeted. Anything that's option news that doesn't already have a history that jumps as high as this one does, run like the plague, or sell if you have it, but do not buy, is really the thing. I can't believe this book jumped that high and it did not hold. I couldn't believe it jumped that high to begin with, knew it wouldn't hold, and it didn't. So I guess the way I said that was confusing. But anyway, next we have Static, Shadows of Darkness, #1, the Oliver Coipel 1/100 foil cover. This is a gorgeous Coipel cover. Back then, this 1/100 was going for 150 to 180. I wondered about this one. I called it a trap. I was a little wrong. This is still going for 150, but only 2 sales. There are several listed, but only 2 sales at 150. But this is pretty steady on the I'll Be Back side because the sales are on the lower end of it. But yeah, definitely a book that's held up pretty well. Although 2 sales makes you wonder how long it's really going to be sustainable with this. But so far, so good for this Static cover. Next, we have Amazing Spider-Man #19. The Glotta person... These Disney variants, Personato, 1/100. Another one of the Disney variants. Another one that's on a Spider-Man book, even though it's homaging a Fantastic Four book, and it says Fantastic Four. I do not understand their choices by putting all these on ASM books. But anyway, raw copies back then were going for 110 to 140 on this 1/100. And this one has turned into a bit of a trap. 50 to 115, you're going to be like, oh, and there's really just the one sale over 100 there, that 115. Most of them are like 80-ish, kind of the center of this. 150 to 235 for a 9.8, which is pretty good. For 1/100, this month's late to be doing this well. It's not that bad, but it's definitely a trap compared to those initial prices back then. Next, we have Storm and the Brotherhood of Mutants. #1, the Art Adams one at 50. Back then, this was going for $75 to $80 for a 1 in 50, which is not even double ratio, which usually instantly means a trap. If you follow the rules, whatever you think about the character, it's usually not a good sign. This one didn't quite turn into a trap, but close, borderline, I'll be back trap, 50 to 60. But here's the interesting thing. Only 2 sales, no current listings. So there's not a lot of these out there. I am curious if this might be one that might eventually become a bit of a ghost and might actually start climbing later on. Just a thought. If you stumble across this one for a good deal, I would be tempted. But I would definitely want a decent deal. I wouldn't chase it for big money. But just the fact that there's none listed this recently and it was only a 1 in 50 surprised me a little bit. And so it's not like there's been a ton of sales, not like a ton listed. This is one I would keep my eye on later on. This could become one of those ghost books that just goes for big money. Who knows? Next, our last cover, at least from the CBSI side, Red Goblin, #1, the In-Hyuk Lee 1 in 100 Virgin variant. Back then, this 1 in 100 was going for 125, 140. Typically, again, trap 1 in 100 doesn't follow the normal double, triple ratio rules of like a 125, 1 in 50, but normally it's got to get higher than this to not become a trap. This one's now a $30 to $90 book. 9.8, only 2 sales, 1 for 100, 1 for 200. I think the 200 was probably an overpay, but yeah, this has turned into a dumpster fire on that raw side. This book is back way, way up. I don't know if this Red Goblin series is still going. I know Norman's still technically good at the moment, but I don't think that's going to last very much longer. So yeah. All right. With that, we had one Sony Spiders book with, Across the Spider-Verse still on the way at this point, and that was Spider-Man Noir, first appearance of Spider-Man Noir. Basically, supposedly Amazon, again, had greenlit a Spider-Man Noir series. So so it really didn't have to do with the animated movie. I'd forgotten this. I'm looking at my notes. It had to do with another Amazon show potentially here. So 225 to 300 for raw copies back then, 9.8, 450 to 500, and now it's backed up a little bit, 115 to 220 on a raw copy, 4 to 450 on a 9.8, so we'll call this a down and I'll be back. It slid back a little bit, back kind of to where it tends to be. Now this is a book that has a lot of value, has a lot of interest all the time, whether there's a series or show coming, either way. All right, next we got 3 DC News books to wrap up our CBSI portion of the list, or I should say our CBSI only portion of the list. Weird Tales #93, back on the list for the second week in a row. First appearance of the Creature Commandos. Last week when we talked about it, it was about 100. By this point, it was 150 to 200 for raw copies. 9.4s went for 5 and 525. Now it's a 125 to 175. $175 book for a raw copy, and a 9.8, not a 9.4, 9.8 only went for $660. Yeah, this has turned into a trap. Not quite the dumpster fire I predicted at those prices, but definitely a trap, as this book has definitely backed up significantly. Obviously, that low end of the raws, around $25, $30 is definitely a dumpster fire, but compared to those others, but most of the raw sales are significantly more than that. Next, we have Creature Commandos, #1. So their first solo title, or first team title, I guess. Back then, it was going for 40 to 60 after being a $20 book last week. Now it's a $10 to $20 book. So this is definitely a dumpster fire, going from $50 average to a $15 average. Not a good bet on this one. So yeah, if you waited till the second week to try to get on these books, much worse off as they continue to peak. And then our last CBSI book was 7 Soldiers, Frankenstein, #3, first appearance of Lady Frankenstein, $25 to $30 back then, and now a $10 to $20 book, another trap. I think we're actually getting close to this Creature Commandos show coming, but yeah, they've definitely cooled. Interestingly enough, when I talked about them last week, I was like, oh, they were pretty steady. They didn't really cool off as bad as I thought. Well, the true peak didn't come to the second week, and yeah, they've definitely cooled off from there quite a bit. All right, we're going to move into the Tom-only books here. First up, we have Criminal #1. This was another show option, or another book option for an Amazon show. Back then, raw copies were going for 10 to 25. Now it's 10 to 20. So we're going to call this steady, and then I'll be back. Throughout that same range, didn't really back up. top end is maybe backed up a little bit, hence the I'll Be Back. But yeah, this is a book that's still going right there. And I feel like this has probably almost always been like a $10, $15 book anyway. So 10 to 20 now with news that it might become a show. Next, we have Micronauts #1, the first appearance of the Micronauts. This has been on and off the list a bunch of times, just, for various reasons. And it was hitting the list this time because there were rumors we were going to get a version in Ant-Man, which is fine, but it wasn't going to be them because Marvel didn't have the rights to put them in Ant-Man. So, yeah, this was funny spec kind of back then anyway. But it jumped back to a $10 to $30 book, 9.8, 140 to 175. And it's been very steady. It's 10 to 25, 150 to 200 on the 9.8 side. We're going to call it steady I'll Be Back versus steady Worth It, just because most of the sales are on the raw side and they are down just a touch. But Micronauts is still going strong. And I feel like really, I'm wondering if this was more of because I didn't write down the note, if there was more of a percent increase in sales and a value jump, because I feel like this is probably about where this book just sits long term anyway. Next, we have Avengers #267, the first appearance of the Council of Kangs. And obviously this, again, had to do with Ant-Man and with Kang and some of the projects that have been announced that we were going to get more of Kang. So right in the lead up to Ant-Man, this was going for 15 to 45, 9.8, 225 to 290 on this one. Now it's a 15 to 65. Interesting. The higher end raw copies are actually going for more now. 9.8, 200, which is a little bit of a step back, but not much, and not very many sales of 9.8. So we're going to call this steady Worth It because that upper end has climbed. To me, that makes it into the Worth It side of steady, although most of the sales are still in that original range. Obviously, the couple of 9.8 sales have backed up a touch, but not a ton. So, all right, next, we have Static #1, which is kind of our one comic buzz book of either list really this week. The first appearance of Static, and that's had to do with the series being relaunched. We just talked about Static, what was it, Shadows of Dakota. Earlier we talked about the cover. Well, this was also causing, that new series launching was causing the original book to hit the list. Back then raw copies were going for 25, 9.8, 160. Now raw copies are 15 to 50, which is, this is one of those where Tom gives an average and you wonder really what the range was on that average of 25. But yeah, so 15 to 50 now, 9.8, 115 to 160. Again, a little bit of a backup on the 9.8 side. Appears like a slight probably increase on at least the upper end of the raw sales. So we're going to call this one steady and Worth It also because more sales are on the raw side again by quite a bit. But yeah, so Static, again, this is not that far off from where this book kind of just sets. So, all right, 3 books left, all related to the DC news that were separate from the ones we talked about before. First up, we have Stormwatch 37, first appearance of Jenny Sparks and Jack Hawksmoor, also on the list for second week in a row. But it already kind of come down. Last week when we talked about it, it was a $50, $60 book is the way they were for sales. By this point, it was a $25 to $60 book. So the higher end copies were still going up around 60, but the lower end had definitely dropped down some, back down to around 25. Now it's a $15 to $45 book, 9.8, 560, but that's only one recent sale. So I take that with a grain of salt. So down and I'll be back on this one as this book did back up some, but not a crazy amount. All right. Next, we have Batman Battle for the Cowl #3. This is the first Damian Wayne as Robin. So this is kind of at the end of the story arc. Bruce Wayne was dead at the time. Dick Grayson had taken over as Batman, and he had made Damian his Robin. So back then this was a $4 to $15 book. Now it's an $8 to $12 book. So I don't know that it gets any steadier than that. It just tightened up to the range there in the middle. We're going to call it I'll Be Back because it didn't really climb any. So you didn't really lose anything by waiting. But yeah, pretty cheap for the first Damian as Batman. As Robin. Yeah, still a pretty cheap book, and yeah, one I would bet you could find in back issues for a couple bucks at the most. All right, next we have Superman #53. This is just hit the list just because it was a cool flag cover, and it has the old slogan, "Truth, Justice, and the American Way," which has been replaced for a while now as "Truth, Justice, and a Better World." But basically, the reason this book hit the list was Peter Safran, who's working with James Gunn on all this stuff, used the original slogan when he was talking about the movie. But my guess is that was just probably doesn't mean anything. And this book doesn't necessarily have anything to do with it other than it has that original slogan. But Tom put it on the list because a bunch of copies sold. It was going for $3 back then on average. 9.8 hit 90. Now if you really kind of look at it, it's really kind of a $5 to $15 book. So I guess we'll call this steady and worth it. You can say up, but $3 average sales, it's probably more like, when you figure in shipping and everything else, it was probably a $3 to $15 book or whatever back then, or at least $3 to $10. So we're going to call it steady and worth it, as we do get a slight climb here. Cool cover if you're into Superman. Probably a fun cover from the 90s to get, that's maybe a little harder to track down compared to some of the others, just because it wasn't necessarily part of the whole Death of Superman stuff. So, all right, that is this week's list. 17 books. A lot of steady books this week. 7 of the 17s kind of stayed steady or around the same range, but no books that went up, and several dumpster fires as well. So I want to thank you guys for watching. I hope you got something out of this, and we will catch you next time.